All right. Why don't we go ahead and get started? We had a lot of great discussions during the break. We have a couple of things that we think are worth talking about, but we also, given this is the last lecture, wanted to see if there were any questions or topic areas or things that people felt would be worth us discussing.
Do you have any questions or about anything? Doesn't have to be about what we lectured on. That,
Go ahead.
Yeah, Professor Murphy, what kind of price theory books do you think are good, like, from your perspective?
That's a good question. Yeah, Gary, Milton's book, I think, is quite useful. Gary's book is very useful. I mean, don't you think those are two good ones? George's old book
is good.
George's old book is okay, right?
Yeah.
Theory of Price.
I mean, it depends on what you want to learn. I mean, a lot of books use Mascalay and
Mascalay, Winston, and Green.
And forgetting the sort of mathematical structure at an abstract level, that's a very well done book. It doesn't give you much in the way of using economics as an engine of what we call an engine of analysis. Okay? So we don't teach the course that we give, we don't use that.
Although we assign the chapters,
Well, we may assign some chapters, but we really don't do that. But it does what it does well. If you want to look at price theory as a tool of analysis, then Kevin mentioned a few books like Friedman's book, my book. There are a few others. We don't. There are a few others, but these are very different style books. What there isn't a good book maybe that takes price theory as an engine of analysis and incorporates a lot of the developments in recent years. But both these other books are pretty old already. I don't think there's a good book that does that. Is there?
No. I don't think so. No, there's nothing, right?
That's the book you were supposed to write, Jeff.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I was thinking.
Yeah. Well, maybe he'll write that book. But I mean, that's what we need. I think. That incorporates new developments, has more information, behavioral analysis, just a lot of topics that one could use the same analysis for, but you'd have to develop it and alter it in certain dimensions. Yeah.
I'm curious about your view of where you see price theory in the different areas of the frontier of economic research now. Because my sense is that most theorists are doing a lot more contracts, game theory, dynamic models. Empirical researchers are doing more empirics, informed and inspired by price theory, but they're not exactly doing price theory. And so it's sort of like an underpinning, but I'm curious about your view.
Yeah, well, let me give you a couple words and Kevin give you his view. I think you're right about that. That there is, I mean, there are kind of two different groups. One group doing, I'll give you a different cut on it, but it's related to what you're saying. One group doing basic theory of varying degrees of generality and so on. Maybe contract theory, maybe something else. Another group doing pretty empirically oriented group, doing good, interesting work, worrying about, how do you get a real natural experiment or an experiment in the field or in the data. We're not bringing in that much theoretical analysis, particularly in marketing delivery analysis. And the amount of research that sort of has good theory in it, but is oriented also to interpreting the evidence. I think that is much more limited. I think that's not zero, and if people are doing it very well, but I think there's a big gap in that dimension. I don't know, you understand that?
I guess I see price theory probably playing its biggest role in two areas. One, to, like you said, I think, serve as a guide or a basis for kind of empirical type analyses, and I think I'd like to see price theory play a bigger role there. That has more influence and more, because I see lots of papers coming through that, while I don't see them as adopting a huge price theory core to their paper, but they can be made a little bit better by thinking about how they interact with markets or how competition affects them. How you interpret the results that
I'm
other
going to
micro
comment a little bit on that, because I think that's important. We emphasize that again. Some of the price theory at the individual level, I think, in order to understand how a lot of things work themselves out, you have to use it at the market level and the general equilibrium level. But you have to see how the adjustments on both supply and demand side influence the outcome. Whatever the competitive monopoly, whatever it is, how that influences the outcome. And I find in a lot of literature that I read, because I've been interested in, for a long time in things like how you extend the utility function, discuss different issues, the role of altruism, or things of that type. Not enough embedding that in a kind of a group or aggregate or market outcome. I think that's a big limitation in terms of interpreting some of the findings you get in that literature.
I know, I think that's right. So I see one role the price theory should play, and it does play, but needs to play, I think can play a bigger role, is kind of shaping that research and really shaping the interpretation of that research. What do you make out of it? I mean, take the example Steve gave yesterday. I mean, one of the things is you end up with a result about how the guy prices bagels. And the question is, what are the reasons why the guy would price in that direction? Why do we see that? Is he just making a mistake, or are there other forces at work in the market? And the disadvantage of that approach is it's more complicated, right? I mean, that was one of the things. The profit maximization condition was easy to understand. Now you put it in a market context that says, well, maybe he's going to lose customers, maybe he has to compete against Dunkin'. Oh, it's a more complicated world. It's not as complicated as general equilibrium, but it's more complicated than kind of partial equilibrium. I mean, individual levels. So
Yeah.
it's not easy, but I think it's often the next step. Sometimes it's the first step because, like you had before, you can have some little model of how the individual responds to misinformation, but unless you think about how the market works, you don't really know the ultimate consequence of that. And as you saw in the example we did here, the quantitative significance of something could dramatically change when you put the market in.
Another example of that, Kevin, when I worked on discrimination, I was impressed by the following fact. If you did a survey, as people did, about people's prejudices, this was a while back, people were free to express prejudice they had. Done a lot of prejudice. On the other hand, when you look at the market equilibrium, let's say for entrepreneur, then you're emphasizing not so much the average degree of prejudice among individuals. Let's say you do an experiment. You have 50 people, you find they're prejudiced against Muslims, and women, African Americans, whoever, Jews, whatever. And let's say, and you really can get them to elicit the right answer. It's not easy. What they thought were their true beliefs. On the other hand, if you look at how the market works itself out, the market tends to select out those people who are least prejudiced, because that's where the greater profits are going to be. And so the equilibrium that you see in the prejudice, taste-based discrimination literature doesn't have no discrimination, but it has much less discrimination frequently than what the average would be. You can't get that from just doing an experiment and sampling a group of people in the lab or even in the field until you see how the market operates. And that taught me an important lesson that has stayed with me, that you have to look at the market outcomes before you can really understand how things like prejudice or anything else is going to be operated.
I mean, another example would be in the area, for example, of greenhouse gases. Let's say the United States were to introduce a program whereby we substitute from greenhouse producing things like coal and oil and other, particularly oil, let's say, to other forms of energy that produce greenhouse gases but are less of them. What would be the impact of that on worldwide greenhouse gas emissions? Would the greenhouse gas emissions that we reduce translate 1-to-1 into world greenhouse gas reduction? So let's say we reduced our oil and, you know, we got 100 million less greenhouse gas from oil, and we substituted and got 50 million from some alternative. So the net would be minus 50 greenhouse gas from the US. What would happen?
That we made oil cheaper for the rest of the world?
Yeah, well, we freed up this amount of oil. What would happen in a world where the supply of oil was fixed? No, but what would happen to total greenhouse gas emissions?
Yeah, you should know, we were just talking about that.
They would,
Won't change too much because
No,
world
well,
demand becomes.
could it go up? That is, they could burn all the 100 we would have burned. We burn our 50 extra, we end up with 50 more rather than 50 less. So that's an example of how you have to think about a market, right? You can't really just say, well, I'm doing less, so isn't that good? Well, the rest of the world isn't passive in that reaction.
And they may do it.
They were worse than we would.
They would do it worse than we do it.
Yeah, so, I mean, this shows to show you got to think about how the market responds. And failing to realize that there's a market for fossil fuels out there, and us using less doesn't mean less gets used. Maybe some less gets used. If supply slopes up, some less will get used, but not one for one. You know, you have to think about how that plays out. Of course, they're going to use more oil, they're going to use less of something else. And you got to think, I mean, the point here is you got to think about, you can't, the aggregate effect is not just my effect. You got to, it all plays through the system. And markets are a useful way to think about it. And I think you have the right logic. The price of oil is going to adjust. And when the price of oil adjusts, that's going to have implications about usage of various fuels. Okay? That would be a good example of bringing the market into the analysis. Yeah.
I have a question about welfare in general, because I noticed that not much was said about welfare, but a lot of the times, like, we are interested in assigning a number to welfare changes, and I was just wondering if you could say something about that, like what you think of those numbers.
Meaning how I approach welfare? I mean, I think production theory, I mean, consumer theory has first order tools for dealing with welfare, right? We talked about that last time. That, you know, the change in utility can be measured off of prices times change in quantities, which is equivalent to changes in income minus changes in price index, right? Those are all equivalent ways of dealing with it. I think economics is the most powerful tool out there for doing welfare
I know
calculations.
we were doing that started calculations in the course of these lectures. We did it.
That was the triangle we just did.
Credit card issue today, right? Or whatever that. So yeah, so I mean, in that sense, I think you use the tools that have developed to analyze welfare economics in a way where you can get some mileage out of it. Basically, tools that come out of economic theory. And they're, in terms of the instance of taxes, the cost of taxes, the cost of externalities, you have a greenhouse gas, how do you assess the effect on welfare of having atmospheric pollution? I mean, it's a basic tool. You may have to sum over different markets, so you look at it often in a more general equilibrium way, not just in a single market.
But I think the other important part of it, though, is all the leverage we get about welfare, and really our definition of welfare comes from the idea that what makes people better off is what they would choose. I mean, that's, if you get away from that, then everything we're doing here isn't very useful for measuring welfare, because welfare is synonymous with what people would choose. Now, you can bring in misinformation and say, like we did there, you know, this is what they would choose, and this is what they actually choose. So, but we're still measuring welfare off of what they would choose, okay, in some fully informed or some other notion of the world. For many things like market goods, that's easy. It leads to prices as the natural measure. For other things, I was talking to a group yesterday about the problem of capital punishment. And we wanted to measure, well, how much worse is it to be on death row than to not be on death, to be life in prison? Well, people don't usually get to choose directly which one of those they're on, so you have to have some metric for measuring the welfare difference. You have to translate it into some choice. So you have to often roll the problem back a stage to where people are actually choosing. Or in the drunk driving example, I'm choosing who do I go to the bar with, okay? I'm getting to a level at which there's choice from which I can infer value and cost because I can see how those choices are affected by components of cost. And maybe there are components of cost that I can't measure and components of cost that I can. And remember, I think in the first section we talked about cigarettes, and we said, I know how much people reduce their consumption when I put a tax on. Therefore, if I measure how much they reduce their consumption for some other change, I can infer value off of the equivalent quantity changes. Turns out that's a very useful way. So for example, go back to Gary's example, where he had the elasticity of demand. And I see, you know, that when I made the light bulbs better, people bought a different amount of light bulbs. And then the question is how many more light bulbs did they buy or less light bulbs? I can infer how much better the light bulbs are by how much they change their consumption. You know, how do we know that, you know, how would you measure how much more valuable 3G wireless is over the previous generation? Well, one of the big ways you measure it is how rapidly people shift. If everybody who has a perfectly good old phone throws it away and shells out the money for a new phone when the new phones come out, you can infer that's a big improvement over the old one. And you can ask what price gap would have to be in order to cause that same change, and you can quantify how much better the new phone is than the old
It
phone.
does. I mean, like in new drugs, welfare economics on new drugs, basically, empirically you're trying to approximate the area under the consumer surplus that you're generating from that drug. And you can show, for example, why most of the consumer surplus is not obtained even with a patent system by the drug company, just by using that welfare analysis. But one point I wanted to make, which is you made it in a little different way, is the theory you're using for positive economics to try to understand people's behavior is going to generate the theory you're going to use for welfare economics. And the theory we use for positive economics, and pretty much all economists use, is a theory based upon choice and willingness to pay. Using that theory, then that gives you pretty directly a welfare theoretic interpretation of different things, and gives you a way to measure different things. Now, if you had a radically different theory about how people behave, your welfare economics might be completely different. So it is very much dependent upon your theory you're using to explain behavior.
Let me give you an example. Let's say you're interested in knowing when people think about redistribution, one of the questions people ask is, you know, well, how much preference do people have for equality? How much preference do people have to have a more just distribution, more even distribution of income? What kinds of things might you look at in individual behavior to see how strong that preference is? Again, you want to know. You want to measure preferences. You got to look at choices. Any idea?
Charity contributions.
Charity contributions might be one. What about people, how they deal with their own children? Do people, people often have children who earn very different incomes. One child earns a lot of income, one child earns a little income. Might you learn something by looking at how much they tend to offset those differences in income? That they transfer more to the person who earns less and transfer less to the person who earns more? Don't you think that would help you understand how much stronger people's preferences for equality is?
That's just within their family, though, right? Like, that's not cross.
Okay, but why do I,
Yeah.
which one do you think would be stronger? Okay, so if I don't see people doing a whole lot to offset those differences within a family, what would I learn? Yeah, so,
On the
so,
other hand, Kevin, like people that, I mean, in that example, there's a couple ways to envision equality. One is like, I want in the end everybody to be equal. Another way is I want to give equal amounts to everybody regardless of where they are. And definitely some people think of that in distributing stuff to their kids, think of that as equality. That even if one kid makes no money, one kid's
but
making.
why do they think about it that way?
I
Why
do not
don't
know.
they say,
I
well,
find it
this
fun.
guy's poor, so I should give him more, and this guy's rich, I should give him less?
I think that's right. I'm just saying empirically, a lot of people that I know have people, their siblings, they have this strong, and the kids have this strong feeling also that even though I'm doing better than my brother, why should he get more money? I deserve half of the money.
It's a little tricky. It's a little tricky. If you look at the data, you do find that to the extent we can look at bequests are pretty equal across kids, even when they're earning different amounts. So that would support what you're saying. On the other hand, we know much less about gifts. Intergrievous gifts. And my impression from the gift evidence is there's much more inequality in gift. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to offset. I mean, the classical dilemma.
Some people give more to the guy who's not.
The issue you face, let's say
You have to give him a good gift for Christmas, after all, he's rich, right?
No, but let's say you have two kids, you love them equally, one kid is abler than the other kid. You have to invest a limited amount in the human capital of different kids. You give more to the abler kid or the less able kid? That's a classical trade-off that society is facing. On the other hand, it's more efficient to give to the more able kid, in general.
I think the other evidence.
On the other hand, it's more equitable in terms of equality to give to the less favorable kid. And different families work that out differently.
And I think it is interesting to look at the family
Absolutely.
as a laboratory for what you might get. And one thing people do though, if they have a handicapped child, somebody who's like ex-ante handicapped relative, they do make big differences in the amount of transfers inter vivos and otherwise that they do make between the children. So there seems to be a distinction that people make between ex-ante differences and ex-post
Well, I
differences.
think, the way I'd interpret that would be the handicapped child, the incentive structure isn't affected by giving. So you give them, you compensate them. On the other hand, a big problem, I mean, there's also a social problem, so you
Yeah, so the parallels here are pretty good.
You know, but if a child knows I'm gonna help them, when they get into trouble, they're gonna get into more trouble, right? They're gonna take gambles, I mean, they're not
So do
altruistic for
banks,
me.
by the way.
I mean, that's what's called the Good Samaritan problem. So that's a society problem. I mean, that's what's called moral hazard, and the generalizations of moral hazard. If big banks know they're gonna be bailed out when they get into trouble, more big banks are gonna get into trouble. They'll take a risk, they succeed, they'll keep the money. If they fail, society will bear part of it.
I think with the handicapped child, what might be coming into play also, which is relevant for society, is that it takes a lot more resources to keep that child from falling below a certain level.
Absolutely.
You know,
Yeah.
so I mean, if that child, like, if one kid didn't have a feeding tube, he might starve. The feeding tube is expensive, but you can't have one of your children starving. So
Yeah, no, absolutely. But I think families draw a distinction, as we do in society, between children who are in difficulty because no fault of their own, they have a handicap, and children who are in difficulty because they blew their money, in different ways. You know, in My Fair Lady, the musical, there's a song about the deserving poor and the undeserving poor, and the song is, we're undeserving, why don't we deserve money as much as everybody else? Why don't we deserve it more? Well, society struggles with that problem. I think parents struggle with that problem as well.
And I think related to that, there's a difference between equality in income and equality in utility. You know, like my sister's going to be a lawyer. Like my parents are not going to make up my salary difference
Absolutely.
because they know that I'm getting something else from the lower
Absolutely,
salary.
yeah. I mean, they'll look at utility. See, we often say, well, you can't make interpersonal comparisons. Parents do that all the time. They do that all the time. I mean, you write down the utility function. The way I like to look at this problem is parents. Here's a parent. They have a utility function depend upon their consumption plus, I say, a very simple form. And kids. And these are the utility of the kids, and they're incorporating that into their overall function. And they're going to maximize, it's going to be their altruism and ability differences and so on. They make that comparison all the time, so parents can do that. They have to do it. Well, I decide what to do. And I presume children do it with regard to their different parents.
Yeah, I mean, the other example kind of related to your example is, this kind of gets back to what Gary talked about earlier today. If you look at like two households that have the same income, say two-parent households, one person works and the other one, two people work, and they end up with the same income, you see they don't consume the same mix of goods. That you know, Gary's theory would predict the one where one person is working is a richer household, right? Because they have more full income, they have the same amount of market income, and you see the mix. They look like they act as if they're richer than the other household in terms of their consumption mix than the other household. So, and then you wouldn't want to offset that either. You wouldn't want to say, well, you want to look at opportunities in some sense. And you and your sister have the same opportunities. You chose to consume more of X, and she chose to consume more of Y. The parents are probably going to take that into account, not just measure the part that the market consumption.
Yeah, and parents care. You can keep extending it, and the parental model, as Kevin said originally, is a really good microcosm of the social problem. I mean, how much in this version, AI is the degree of altruism to an eighth child. That may not be simply exogenous. That may be a function of the behavior of the child. Just like, in habit or addiction models, your preferences in the narrow sense get altered by your behavior. Similarly, how much, if one child keeps doing terrible things and doesn't show you any concern or interest, selfish, you may start liking that child less or more. But it won't necessarily be fixed how much you care about them. And you can actually handle that kind of problem and look at behavior. That's also an elasticity question.
Whether you like them more or less.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, so there's, but the point is to go back where I started, which is you're trying to learn about preferences, learn about values. You got to look for choices that in principle would reflect those values. You want to say, how much do people dislike crime? Well, how much you willing to pay to live in a place that has less crime? I mean, you got to look at it. Is there a market in which this is at least indirectly traded, or an equivalent commodity?
Housing value.
Yeah, equivalent market, where equivalent things are traded. And that's really an important feature. And that's a nice thing about economics. I mean, people know the thing called the envelope theorem. Yeah, everybody knows the envelope theorem. Well, the envelope theorem is actually one of the most useful empirical tools we have, because it says, in order to learn about how somebody values something, I don't have to know what he would do if he got it. In fact, I know that using it in all the different ways he could use it are equally valuable. That's what the envelope theorem relies on. So I can value it in whichever way is the easiest for me as an economist to measure. So for example, you say, well, what's the value of putting fluoride in the water? And you could say, well, in response to fluoride, people are going to get fewer cavities, they're going to brush their teeth less, they're going to do 10,000 different responses to putting fluoride in the water. But if I knew how much less they could go to the dentist holding all other activities fixed, and I knew the cost of the dentist, I could then calculate the value of fluoride. And it's not that that's how they would actually respond, I just know by the envelope theorem that all the margins have to be equal. So I can use any margin. Whatever one is easiest for me to measure is the one I can use. So it actually turns out when people are optimizing, the measurement issues are actually much easier because all the margins are equal. If you get a world where guys aren't optimizing, you're in the world of the second best. I have to know how people would respond in order to say whether the value is positive or negative. Now, I'm going to use that as Andre because I want to do an example. This is one of the things we want to cover today. Think about, back to the greenhouse gas problem, okay? And, you know, there's some supply of greenhouse gases. There's some demand for greenhouse gases. This is all the private. And, you know, think about this as greenhouse gas emissions on this axis. And, you know, these are derived demands derived through the demand for oil and all kinds of other stuff, okay? And people talk about putting on a tax on greenhouse gas emissions in order to reduce G0 to G1. Right? The people talk about putting a tax on greenhouse gas emissions, and they talk about, let's put a tax on T, maybe through a cap and trade, maybe through a direct tax, and, you know, kind of numbers people throw out, 20%, right? So think about that as reflecting the fact that the social cost of greenhouse gases is up here. Right? That's the social cost is up there. So an optimal tax would internalize the externality and lead us to G1 rather than G0. What's the gain from doing that? Well, the gain from doing that is the difference between the social cost and demand over that distance. That's that triangle there, which for simplicity, of course, is equal to that triangle there, just to make life easy. So what's the size of that triangle? It's 0.2 G0 times T divided by 2. Right? That's the size of that triangle. How much revenue would the government raise from that tax? It would be this area here, which is what? It's 0.8 G0 times T equals revenue. 0.2 G0 times T over 2 equals the gain. All right. Now, let's assume that some fraction of that revenue is wasted. We spend it in bad, silly ways. Let's call that fraction lambda. How big would lambda have to be in order to make this not a good idea? That would be better to leave the externality alone. Well, it would be lambda times 0.8 G0T bigger than 0.2 G0T divided by 2, which would be the T's cancel, the G0s cancel, which would be lambda bigger than 1/8. So if you would waste more than 1/8 of the rectangle, it turns out this, even though it seems like a great idea to solve this externality, it turns out that it wouldn't be worth it.
The government would waste.
Yeah, that is-
Government's getting the tax.
Governments are getting it, or maybe it's not just the government, maybe fighting over who's gonna pay it costs some resources. So it might not all be in the spending, it might be in the back.
Show up through the government's back.
Exactly, so we're gonna waste an eighth of it. All right. On the other hand, what if we could use this revenue to offset other taxes? And we know other taxes are distortionary. Then what would the calculus be? We pick up this gain, and we pick up a gain equal to some fraction of the revenue. In which case, this is a no-brainer.
Or if the government could spend it on activities that were of great social
Right.
value, where lambda was,
But let's say I live in this world. Let's say I live in this world. That taxes are distortionary. In my notation, lambda is less than 0. And at the same time, spending is inefficient.
well
Lambda
spending.
bigger than, let's say, bigger than an 8.
Well spending, you say.
Whatever the, no, but this gets back to my question where I started about the envelope here. Let's assume all spending is inefficient and all taxes are distortion.
But the envelope theorem wouldn't be enough for that.
Now the envelope theorem doesn't work, right? It's not enough to know what the government could do. Unlike the guy brushing his teeth, where I didn't need to know whether he was going to choose to brush less, choose to go to the dentist less, choose to have cleaner teeth. I don't need to know which one of those he's going to choose because I know they're all equally valuable on the margin because he's optimizing. If I live in this world where taxes are distortionary and spending is inefficient, which doesn't seem that unlikely, right? You certainly know taxes are distortionary and probably would believe much spending is inefficient. What do I need to know to analyze whether this policy is good or bad? What do I need to know? I need to know what the government will do with the revenue. I need to know whether the guy's going to stop brushing his teeth or take cleaner teeth or not go to the dentist. I need to know which one he's going to do because they don't have equal value. If you think the government's going to spend the money, then you apply this lamp. If you think they're going to cut taxes, you spend that lamp. If you think they're going to do some combination of the two, you got to take a weighted average.
A lot of public finance is based upon the conceptual experiment that you hold revenue, you hold spending constant, you put this on, you cut other taxes. Now, from a positive theory of political economy, we just know that's just not true. That when you add an additional source of revenue, you don't increase spending typically dollar for dollar, but you do tend to increase spending. So in order to understand this from a positive point of view, even though you're doing well for economics, you got to bring that in.
Unless you thought that taxes and spending were being optimized one against the other.
Yeah.
In which case, the two lambdas would be the same.
Right.
That is, if taxes are distortionary, the government spending on the margin has more than dollar for dollar efficiency, and you get the same calculus either way. Okay, so a couple things I take away from this example. First off, is it's just striking how simple the question is in terms of how big lambda has to be. It's also striking how small, how little the waste can be and still make this a good idea. To me, that was surprising that it was like an egg.
Make it bad.
Like to make it a bad idea. How small lambda could be to make doing this not a good idea. Now, if you make this 10% rather than 20%, then of course it's going to shrink even more. Right? It's going to shrink even more from where we're at here. Okay? Any questions that people have about that? Yeah,
So why lambda is the same time less than 0? Is it two different parameters?
well, no, I mean, let me call this lambda tax and this lambda spend. So on the spending dimension, you get less than dollar for every dollar they spend. On the taxing dimension, reducing taxes by $1 gets you more than $1 in benefits because you reduce the deadweight loss as well on the tax side. So
Do we assume the dead weight of the taxes is the same or?
of all taxes?
Yeah.
If there are different taxes, then I got to ask the question, not only will the government cut taxes, but which taxes will they cut?
Because if we assume they're the same, then these lambdas are equal because we increase like one waste and increase the same waste.
Well, no, I mean,
Which
across the different taxes or across taxes and spending?
Across different taxes.
Well, I don't think there's any reason to believe that all taxes are equally distortionary. Certainly the theory of political economy wouldn't tell me that all taxes would be equally
But even
distortionary.
if there was, so then you'd have a single
Lambda tax.
Right? And that's what you would use. If it's more complicated, if there's different degrees of this. And in some optimal tax analysis, you would think they would all be equally distortionary at the margin. But if you didn't have that, then you'd have to worry about how they actually are going to cut taxes.
It's hard to understand, I mean, from a political economy theory, it's not so easy to get all of them equally.
No, in general, they won't be from the economy point of view.
Yeah.
Is it right to think in the long run, once innovation happens, that 1/8 cutoff might grow either because supply will keep shifting left because people develop energy that doesn't produce greenhouse gases, or demand will shift
Well, that
in?
just means that the demand and supply curves are more elastic, right? If you have a world in which the demand and supply curves are more elastic, then you get a smaller tax, or for the given tax, if you hold the externality fixed, this number will be bigger. The bigger this number is, the smaller that number is over there, okay? So,
And you would expect the long-run supply and demand elasticity would be greater, maybe considerably greater than the short run in this case.
so I mean, the more general formula is lambda times 1 minus f G0T bigger or less than, if f is the fraction reduction, f G0T over 2. So this implies lambda bigger or less than f over 1 minus f 2 1 minus f. That's the more general formula. And in the long run, presumably f would be a bigger number, which would make the lambda cutoff easier to meet. That lambda, you could sustain a bigger lambda and still be efficient.
From a global warming point of view, you'd expect the long run to be adjustments in technology, innovation to try to economize on the carbon emissions, maybe ways to affect how much damage the carbon does through various ways. So that might be a really crucial adjustment that you wouldn't have in the short run, but you'd have in the long run.
Well, the 20% figure wasn't a short run figure that I took, right? People aren't saying if we put on greenhouse gas restrictions tomorrow, we would cut consumption 20%. That's just like, we want to cut them 20% over the next decade or over the next these are relative. I don't want to say long term, because in that business, long term might be really long, but in the usual economic notion of long term, the 20% is a kind of a long term number. The math is worse in the short term, right? The math in the short term is F is a much smaller fraction. You're going to cut output, per emissions 5%. So revenues are huge relative to the triangle in that case. So lambda, in the short one, would have to be even smaller to make it make sense. Okay? The nice thing about the example is just how simple it is. It just sort of illustrates what happens. Any other questions that people have? Any other topics that have been interesting you and whether there's something related to price theory that.
Any of you working on dissertation yet?
Yes.
All right, you might have. Well, you have anything about your dissertation you'd like to raise? You all have it under control?
All right, let's talk about it. Yeah.
I see that, Kevin, that when you talked about the macroeconomic stuff at that panel, I thought that was pretty interesting because that was essentially like price theory applied to macro. So I don't know if you want to talk about that at all.
Okay,
I mean, it's kind of related to this stuff here.
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about the kind of the stimulus package kind of things that I did. The other is we can talk a little bit. I'll do that, but let me make one other price theory point. This is something that I just started thinking about on Monday. So this is like, I haven't got very far. So this is like the beginning. But I think it's instructive to see how things start, at least for me. I was thinking about the financial crisis. And one of the things about the financial crisis that's striking is that there was this kind of herd mentality that everybody kind of made a mistake at the same time. And so the natural question I think an economist would ask is, what economic forces tend to prevent herds from happening? And the usual answer is it's the force of supply and demand. If there's a potential contingency out there where everybody's going to need an umbrella and nobody else saves umbrellas for that day, then I have a huge incentive to be the guy who saves umbrellas because there's going to be a shortage of umbrellas and I'm going to make a killing. So what you'd like to see is a way to kind of prevent this kind of collective neglect, that there be a large payoff to those who did participate in the herd relative to those who did. And what's sort of striking to me about the ex post aftermath of the crisis is that being a good bank that didn't do stupid things and doesn't seem to have paid off that well. So there's something about the market, and maybe it's network effects that, if nobody else has an umbrella, then why should I have an umbrella? It's like if, I was talking to Gary yesterday when there was an analogy we came up with, which is like, let's say there was a potential catastrophe where phones were going to get destroyed, and nobody took precautions to protect their phone. Well, then I wouldn't want to protect my phone either because I would have nobody to call. So, we might all want to protect our phones, and so the network effect kind of created this feedback that pushed you toward this kind of collective problem. And I think there has to be some of that operating here, whether it's network effects, whether it's government policy, that's going to punish the guys who did take precautions along with the guys who didn't in terms of rules and regulations and things like that. But I'm not sure it's all government. So the government's going to play a role, but also the market's going to play a role in the characteristics of the market. So given this is an idea I've had for a couple of days and haven't gotten that far, but that's kind of the starting point. See, the starting point for me in thinking about it is, how does economics work? Well, how do we prevent ourselves from getting in these situations generally, and why didn't that work here? And to me, that's at least how I started thinking.
One of the problems, I think, aside from the government, that people, can get bailed out, then you might as well not take the same risk as everybody else. You can hide through the fact that you're all in that boat. So even the bailout has this kind of network effect. If you're the only one doing badly and if you're not too big, well, you're not going to be helped. They'll let you go on. But if everybody is. The other issue would be that even if you're a good bank and did pretty well and you weren't affected, you have no desire really to be lending now.
That's part of the network. That's part of the
the market, the demand and the risk, the assessment of the risk it went up so much. So, people were putting their money into treasury bills. They weren't lending it, even though there were people who wanted money for investment, so they couldn't get them. Private equity field dried up. everything else, I mean, maybe that's a network of an aggregate or a macro effect of what was going on. But I think, that's what hurt the big banks, the good banks that didn't have a lot of bad liability. You look at the German banks. German banks weren't involved in this situation. They didn't have the housing crisis. They didn't have some of the others. Nevertheless, they were doing badly because German exports were way down the whole, and so German businesses weren't really borrowing that much to invest. I don't know how, it's a macro analysis. It doesn't, the first variable says, well, it doesn't matter if you get into trouble and everybody else is in trouble. The other one says, well, even if you're not in trouble, your profitability is going to go down a lot. What the forces are, I don't know.
I think it's interesting because it's a mixture of market interaction forces that seem to generate kind of this feedback.
Yeah.
And this is a more general issue that I think is actually a really interesting issue in thinking about markets in general, is which markets kind of, through the forces of supply and demand, lead to kind of positive feedback effects versus negative feedback effects. I think that's a thing where where economics can help you think a lot. And let me give you kind of a couple examples. And one sort of related comes out of what Gary talked about before. Remember we talked about the household having various endowments, sort of energy and time,
Not
attention
energy in terms of
span,
electricity,
time.
but personal energy.
Personal energy or attention or concentration ability. And if you think about a world in which people have endowments of various things, and those endowments are fixed, then what happens when something changes in the market that causes more demand for an input for goods that use a lot of energy, for example? So my job changes, so my job at work requires more energy. What's going to happen is the shadow price of energy is going to get bid up. That's going to raise the price of all energy-using commodities, and the household will switch away from using things that use a lot of energy. That's what I think of as the negative feedback world. That's the world where when there's more demand for energy, the energy-induced other activities that use energy shrink. Okay? And that's the standard supply and demand world, has that characteristic. There's this natural
Most of the issues we deal with.
Okay, now think about a world where endowments are not fixed, but actually endowments are things you invest in, like human capital. And more importantly, they're not subject to this kind of competition for time. So instead of energy, it's like know-how. I go to school, I learn how to use a computer, and I don't have a fixed capacity for using a computer. I can use it at work and use it at home, and there's not rivalry, okay? Now what happens? My job changes so that there's more demand for me to use a computer. So I learn how to use a computer. So I use the computer more at work. Now what happens in the household in that case? Do the computer using activities shrink? No, they grow. There's a complementarity now that exists. In the human capital world, there's a complementarity that exists where things that make you want to do more of an activity that uses a given input actually spurs usage of other things that use those inputs. That positive feedback is a really important part of lots of economics. And distinguishing markets that are characterized by one versus the other, it really makes a huge difference. For example, think about like being in a big birth cohort, okay? So I'm in a big birth cohort, that's going to help me and it's going to hurt me. Where does it hurt me? It hurts me in things that have upward sloping supply, like housing. I end up paying a lot for housing because me and all my buddies want to buy houses at the same time, and then we're going to ultimately all want to sell houses at the same time, and we're going to get screwed on both ends.
Is that an externality?
Well, it's a big unity.
So let's say your parents somebody's talking to you about fertility externality. If your parents had an additional kid and it led to a larger birth cohort, therefore, the wages go down, for example, right? Is that an externality?
It is from the point of view of the parent. Like they just
Well,
decided
wages
But
get
should we do
affected.
this, should we do this to solve that problem?
Wages get affected, no question.
Yeah.
Could we put a tax on having
Parents
kids?
might want to know how many kids other parents are having, because that will affect the wage they get. No question about that. But is it an externality?
Can I think of it as a pecuniary externality and generically influence of this?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a pecuniary, what we would call a pecuniary externality, but it's a transfer. Lower wage to the kids would be transferred to capital or some other resource.
Okay,
So it's not, you wouldn't want to, I forgot who I was talking to about fertility externality, that wouldn't be a fertility externality.
okay, so, now I forget where I was going.
Sorry.
No, it's okay, so what were we talking?
Well, you started to say there are two effects, there's a
Oh, yeah, no, so now let's think about other
Upward
markets.
supply
Now think about another market, like TV or movies. Now you're in great shape being in a big cohort, because all the movies that are being made are going to be made to appeal to you, right? So you're going to get the TV shows and the movies, and then when you get old, the world's going to develop all kinds of goods for old people. And when you were a kid, they developed all kinds of goods for kids, because those have downward sloping supply. So the distinction between this kind of increasing returns markets
basically
and
increasing returns and decreasing returns markets, basically, right?
to me, what's interesting is, everybody focuses though on that market that has increasing returns. What's interesting is the feedback that that market has on all kinds of other markets, right? That is the feedback that that market has, makes other markets behave very differently. I've never done this before, but this should work, so let's see if it works. So think about it this way. We got the demand for good I, depends on P1 up to Pn, and the demand for good K depends on P1 up to Pn. And I'm going to think about how the response of good I to the price of good J is affected by the supply elasticity of good K. So I'm going to get partial Xi, partial Pj, kind of the full one, equals partial Xi, partial Pj, plus partial Xi, partial Pk, because I'm going to let the price of good K vary. I get elasticity of supply, or I guess I'm doing it, I'll do it in elasticity. Let's do it in elasticity. Elasticity of I with respect final with respect to J is equal to the elasticity of I with respect to J plus the elasticity
So you want dP.
I with respect to K times the elasticity of Pk with respect to Pj.
Yeah, that's what you need.
And then I get here the elasticity of supply for K times the elasticity of Pk with respect to Pj equals the elasticity of K with respect to I plus the elasticity of K with respect to K times the elasticity of Pk with respect to Pj. So then I get elasticity of Pk with respect to Pj equals, where am I at here? Elasticity equals epsilon Ki divided by epsilon Sk minus epsilon Kk. Yeah, that's right. Okay, so that's this one. And then all I have to do is substitute that back up here. Epsilon ij full equals epsilon ij plus epsilon ik, epsilon ki divided by epsilon sk minus epsilon k. So what you can see is going to happen is when I make this, if I make this number negative rather than positive, that instead of kind of working to make these things kind of complements or substitutes, it's going to feed into this complementarity story. And in a world where this is large, and this is large in a lot of cases, I mean, we don't pay enough attention to downward sloping supply as an important phenomenon. It really is important for lots of types of
innovation, and investment in human capital, two examples.
Those are two big examples. Is that innovation, as demand rises, innovation actually rises. So the net cost, rather than rising of good K, actually can fall. So instead of this term
one example of that, let me give you an example that we had in our paper on consumption. Say if an increase in the number of people with a college education, you would say, well, in the market sector, if that's sort of happening exogenously, you subsidize college education, that would lower the wage rate of college graduates relative to high school graduates. You look at, now go back to what we were lecturing on earlier, you look at education operating in the consumption sector, and the educated people have different consumer demands, maybe because of income, maybe because of other reasons. That may have some increase in returns there because you'll get more innovation now oriented toward the goods that educated people are consuming because they're more important now rather than others. So the increase in the importance of educated people lowers their wages in the marketplace, but will tend to increase their benefits as consumers.
Exactly. All right, so what's going to happen? See, what's happening here is this. Think about, like, let's say K is a complement for good J. So then when you lower the price of good J, that shifts out the demand for good K. So this is DK0, here's DK1. When you have upward sloping supply, that pushes up the price of good K, which chokes off the demand for everything that's complementary with K. So one complement to K gets more attractive, it pushes up the price of K and chokes off all other things that are complementary. If I switch the supply curve and make it downward sloping, this term switches signs, always.
Aren't profits negative when?
No, because you have to think about it. There's an old work by Alfred Marshall along these lines, which is you have to think about an industry level economy of scale, not a firm level economy of scale. That the industry supply curve is downward sloping, even though the firm supply curve is upward sloping.
Have you ever seen that analysis? No.
So there's like, think for example, like there was a learning by doing component, where everybody in the industry learns from everybody else's production. Then each guy's supply curve is upward sloping, but the industry supply curve could be downward sloping because when everybody produces more, everybody learns more, and costs fall.
Is it similar to like the endogenous growth model?
It's very much like an endogenous growth model.
The Roma model is based on this Marshallian idea. That's what it really is used, applying it from an industry to a macro level.
The other way to think about it is where good K is kind of non-rival. That's the human capital case. That is, it's true that there's more demand for human capital. Maybe the price of acquiring human capital goes up. But that doesn't mean the price of using human capital goes up, because the price of using human capital is kind of independent of the cost of acquiring it. So the demand for computers goes up, so people learn how to use computers in one realm of their life. Well, that lowers the cost of using computers in the other realm of their life, even if the supply of computer knowledge is upward sloping. There's a distinction there between the cost of acquisition and the cost of use. See, one of the things that's really important about human capital is it has this notion that the cost to me of using my skill is independent of how much I use it. So, in fact, it may be even lower the more I use it. So you go to school and you learn something, or you just practice and you learn something, or you just do the activity and you learn something. That lowers the cost of using that skill elsewhere. You can use that skill elsewhere without any problem. People understand how that works? It's a really important result. It says a couple things. One is the incentive to learn is a function of how much you're going to use it.
So you don't become a doctor if you want to work 5 hours a week.
Yeah,
Right?
exactly.
You still have to become a doctor and learn the skills, but you're not going to, your use is so small, it doesn't pay.
Because the cost of becoming a doctor is independent of how much you're going to use it, right? That's it. In terms of human capital, it's one of the most important things in the world. Because it's what drives specialization. That's why people become specialized. Because, you know, take a fully simple world where I can invest my time in either learning activity A or activity B. And my productivity, F of T, is my productivity as a function of how much time I spend learning activity A. So my productivity on A depends on how much time I spend learning activity A. My productivity on B depends on how much time I spend learning activity B. And then I'm going to decide to split my time, my work time. So then I'm going to let tau A equals work time on A, and tau B, work time on B. Then my earnings are tau A, FA of TA, plus tau B, FB of TB. Right? That's what I want to maximize. What do you think the solution to that maximization problem looks like? Yeah, because if you're going to have an internal solution, you'd have to have FA of TA equals FB of TB, and your total income would be tau A plus tau B times, say, FA of TA. Right? That would be because FA of TA is equal to FA of TB. If you have an internal solution for the taus, your productivities would have to be equal to make that make sense. And therefore, it would be equivalent to what you would get if you spent all your time on A. But if you can spend all your time on A, why spend any time learning B? Spend all your time learning A. So then the optimal solution would be like TB equals 0 and spend all your time on A.
That's why I have people who are doctors and people who are lawyers, but you don't have very many people who are doctors and lawyers.
And the
That's
key,
basically what it's saying.
key here is it doesn't matter how concave F is. You can have the most infinite diminishing returns in the world. It could be that you learn really, really quickly at first and really, really slowly after a while. It doesn't matter. F can be as concave as you want, you still get a corner solution.
It's important that there's no interaction between the two, right?
No. Let's say there's an interaction between the two. And this is FA and here's FB. And when there's an interaction between the two, let's say you have a production possibility frontier that looks like that. Where are you going to be? You're going to be either here or here. Which means you won't have 0 of the other skill, but the amount of skill you have for the other activity is just an accident. You either maximize the amount of A skill you have, or you maximize the amount of B skill you have, and
Sorry, what are we maximizing?
I just want to know, this is my production possibility frontier for productivity in A and B.
What can it be anywhere on the market?
Why would I want to be here? Why would I want to be there? If I work in A, I earn less than this guy. If I work in B, I earn less than that guy. And I get to choose where I work.
Oh, and that doesn't happen. So
It's really the effect that you get to choose what you do. Given you can choose what you do, you would always want to fully specialize your skills. Now, fully specialized doesn't mean you have 0 on the other one. It just means you just maximize A, and I learn how to be a doctor, and I learn a few things I need to be a lawyer, but only because that just happened to be the case. There's no incentive to say, well, geez, I can pick up some lawyer skills here pretty cheaply. Don't I want to do it? The answer is no. You just want to be the best doctor you can be. This guy wants to be the best doctor he can be. This guy wants to be the best lawyer.
What if you're like doing malpractice suits or something where it's useful to have that?
Well, then I just want to be the best doctor I can be, which includes knowing something about malpractice. The key here is this is actually an important point. There's a tremendous incentive to specialize.
Or hire a lawyer.
Because the cost of learning to be the doctor doesn't depend on how much you use it. That's what's really important. And I think that's a pretty good description, right? That you go out, you say, I got to get trained. And therefore, in some sense, any force that makes me get more A lowers my cost of all things that would use that skill. And that's an important source of complementarity that came up in Gary's problem. So,
No, it's crucial for the human capital. So now, take the guy who's a biochemist. You might say, well, he's learned. Let's say he's going to be acting as a biochemist, maybe mainly a biologist. Okay, so he'll be mainly a biologist. He may learn some chemistry because that makes him a better biologist, right? You don't rule that out.
no, absolutely. That's this
He
point.
doesn't rule that out.
That's this point. That's why you don't necessarily get B equals 0. And that's why the production possibility frontier actually has this weird shape where it actually bends back, because there's some crossover. If there's no crossover, the PPF looks like that.
Right.
Okay, but if there's a crossover, the PEPF can bend backward like that.
So you don't want to come out by saying there's no biochemists or anything of that type. Of course there are, but you're being a better biologist that way. That's what you're interested in.
Exactly. So it turns out that, so there's an economy of scale, which is equivalent to downward sloping supply, that comes out in cases where there's a fixed cost. There's a fixed cost of getting the good, and that doesn't affect the user costs. That turns out to be, for the household, it's incredibly important, because there's so many things in a household that are like that. You know, you get to learn how to use electronics, you get to learn how to use a computer, you get to do all kinds of things. You know, like your devices that you
All
want.
learning is like that. I mean, if you look at a human capital analysis, usually say, well, you spend time in tuition, going to college, and then you earn. But if you break that down, is how much you're going to earn is going to be from how much investment you made. And how much investment you made isn't going to be contingent. But if you get a college degree or not, if you end up working 2 hours or 20 hours, to have the skill as a college graduate, you have to get the same skill level. I mean, that's a simple way of putting it. You have to get the same skill level. So if you're only going to work 2 hours, you're not going to become a college graduate. You'll be a high school graduate.
Let me give you another example. Let's say low-skilled workers, jobs in the
You
market.
use one other thing. You use the market. And then here's where the market comes in again.
Okay.
You get to all these specialists. You know, if you just ended the analysis like that, you'd have a very incomplete view of what an economy is. Because then these specialists sort of interact with each other in some market equilibrium or some general equilibrium. So you have different specialists combining, and then they form together in teams or some other way to produce the output of the economy.
The other point is that human capital, you don't get to invest in different human capital. You invest in human capital, and your human capital endowment carries you in both the household and the market. That's a very important thing. So think about what would happen in a world where, say for low-skilled individuals, the jobs they have in the market require less responsibility. They have less need to be on time, to do stuff, and manage resources. They're just kind of a robots at work. What would that say about the household? Would they become better managers in the household? There was a fixed amount of if they had a fixed amount of skill for organizational skill that was being allocated between the market and the household, then what you would say is, well, they're not using that skill in the market, so it's going to become cheaper. They'll use more of it in the household. But what if you have a human capital view of the world? What's going to happen?
You will invest less in that skills and you will have less for
Yeah, you'll be less good in the household, right? Exactly. I'll become less good managing my household because I don't need to have those skills at work. And the cost of investing in them now has to be covered entirely by the gains in the household. You're going to invest less. So a kind of dumbing down of jobs in the marketplace actually can have an impact on what people do in the household.
And vice versa.
And vice versa.
You need more skill in the household, that's going to generally make you better in the market.
So there's a complementarity, again, because of this fixed cost nature, as opposed to, it's the increasing returns nature as opposed to the diminishing returns nature. In a diminishing returns world, it would all work in the opposite direction. Things that tapped your skills in the marketplace would draw those skills out of the household. In the increasing returns complementarity view of the world, things that tap your skills in the market actually push those skills into the household, which I think is a really different view of the world. It sort of changes everything on its head. And downward sloping supply and upward sloping supply kind of turns so many things around in terms of how the world works.
Or decreasing returns and increasing returns.
Absolutely.
That's the way I like to think of it. And we don't do enough on increasing return. I mean, some areas like human capital, you have to do it because it's the only sensible way. Whether it's learning by doing or going to school, it's the only sensible way to look at human capital. Investment, innovation, it's the only sensible way to look at innovation. I don't know of any other way to really look at it, investment innovation. But there are a lot of other applications as well, although these are two really major ones.
Yeah. So, I mean, and it also holds across firms. I mean, if somebody comes in and introduces a new type of product or activity, and you should say, well, they're in the market, that would mean fewer other people want to be in the market. But if them being in the market spurs the supply of lots of complementary goods, that can actually induce other people to move in, right? You can actually get, there'll be complements. That is, having, you know, and this was an example, a good example of this was like, you know, like in Blockbuster Video and other video stores, if Blockbuster like advertised a movie, that you can get this movie at Blockbuster and actually raise sales at other video stores because people said, oh, you know, the movie's available, I can go to the other store. So rather than be what you would think would be substitutes, they actually turn out to be complements.
So why they locate? Well,
Yes.
why antique shops locate in the same area?
Yes.
You would think they're drawing business away, but by being there, they pull in more people who sort of circulate around. They may all do better.
So it's a complementarity story again. And what's
Now,
interesting about
this is consistent with you know, I say, well, you have increasing returns, you're not consistent with competition. But a lot of it is consistent with competition. Human capital investment is obviously consistent. The sort of growth literature, you have competition, the externality within an industry. Even in the innovation, you have competition for new innovators and so on. So we have to, again,
I think we're done, huh?
Yeah.
I mean,
unless there's somebody, you had a question.
Oh, I just didn't understand the analogy with that.
I can't hear you.
I didn't understand the case with the antique shops.
Yeah.
Because I don't see how there's increasing returns on the number of people. Because I guess the fixed resource there is the demand, which has to be allocated between different shops. How is that?
You know, where do they locate? Look, I'm looking for an antique. I don't know exactly what I want. I said, I'm gonna go browse. You ever browse in an antique shop? You go browse. Well, if there's 4 or 5 different stores available you can browse in, you're more likely to go to that area, right? Because you have a fixed amount of time. It's again a fixed cost. Your time to get there is a fixed cost.
they're complements again because it's like the TA is now the time that the guy spends to get to the shopping area. And they're complements because it costs me the same cost to drive down to the shopping area whether there's 1 store there or 10 stores there. But if there are 10 stores there, now, remember I said earlier that elasticity really matters? What if the elasticity of the number of customers with respect to the number of shops was less than 1?
Yeah.
Then you wouldn't get this, right?
Separate
Because then you'd put a 2nd store there, so you double the number of stores, but the number of customers would come with less than double. And therefore, customers per store would go down, and the stores wouldn't want to locate there. Okay. Even though customers might still want them to do that, competitive market wouldn't lead them to do that. But if the elasticity is bigger than 1, then you're going to get clustering, because what's going to happen is 2 guys locate, so the number of customers more than doubles. So even though there's 2 stores, they get more than sales than they would have otherwise. Then a 3rd store comes in, and you keep
It's also the shopping mall. I mean, why do you get the shopping mall? It's the same idea. Even though it may not be multiple antique shops, you have all these stores coming together, you shop across these different stores. In fact, the shopping malls, often they'll give a very low price per square foot to, let's say, a major department store, a major shop, because they know that's going to attract customers in whom other stores will benefit from. So your other stores would like the major store to have lower prices because they'll attract other people into it.
All right, thank you. We'll be here tomorrow, so, yeah. Oh, you guys are presenting tomorrow, right? Steve, what do we have this afternoon? Or they're working on their problems this afternoon, right? Okay, all right.
Remember, tomorrow we start at 8:30. The breakfast will still only happen at 8:15, so you should plan to like grab some food and come.
Eat quickly.
Yeah, yes, eat quickly.